Our speaker for today is Nikolaos. He was born in Finland but grew up in Kos, Greece. He fell in love with the Mediterranean Sea and decided to pursue a career studying the world's oceans. He holds a bachelor degree from the University of Thessaly, Greece in marine science and master's degree from Lund University, Sweden in aquatic ecology. He first joined KAUST in February 2019 as a visiting student for Professor Ibrahim Huteit. Currently, he is a PhD student studying phytoplankton in Neom using satellite data. We're excited to have you, and the floor is yours, Nicholas.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. All right. Hello, everyone. Hope you are doing well during these difficult times. I'll try to bring back some hope by the end of this presentation. And if you get any questions at any point, just write them in the chat and I'll try to answer them at the end. So let's get started. So I was lucky to grow up in the beautiful island, of course, as Eman said. As a kid, I loved playing soccer, fishing, snorkeling. Nowadays, I enjoy more beach volleyball, cross-country skiing, climbing, water polo, and free diving. But the sea was always my favorite thing in the world, so I decided to study marine science. And after getting a master's degree in Sweden, I ended up in KAUST. So in Sweden, people care a lot about the environment and sustainability in general, probably because they have solved the other problem they have. So I learned a lot from my new friends there. At that point, I thought my lifestyle was pretty sustainable. I used my bike to move around. I saved water, food, and plastic whenever I could. But then I realized that many of the students there, especially female, did not eat any meat, and the student nations mostly served vegetarian options. So I asked why, and they told me for the environment. Apparently, it created a lot of gases and stuff that were causing climate warming. At that point, I was a heavy meat eater, and as per the Neo-Greek cuisine, of course. But I also cared a lot about the environment and especially the seas. So as a true scientist that I was, I started looking in the literature to see if the Swedish students were correct. Since then, which was around 2017, I have probably studied more about food than about marine biology, and that's why I feel confident enough to give this presentation. So why is food so important? Let's make a few calculations here. The average human eats around 2 to 2.5 kilos of food per day. That is around 15 pancakes per day, which equals to around 730 to 900 kilos per year, which is the weight of a smart car. And that equals to over 50 tons of food in an average lifetime, which is about the weight of 2 adult humpback whales. So if we multiply that by 8 billion people, which we are rapidly approaching as we can see here, you will find out that we will quickly run out of humpback whales. Not humpback whales, but food, you know what I mean. We have to understand that the resources on the planet are finite and may be exhausted during our lifetimes. Therefore, our food system must be as sustainable as possible if we want to feed everyone on this planet, of course. Here we see also the daily supply, and not the actual consumption, of calories since 1961. The big drop for Eastern Europe is at the point the Soviet Union collapsed in 91. But anyway, as we can see, not only is our population growing, but every year our caloric supply as well, which means that the pressure on the environment would keep increasing even if our population remains stable. The huge inequality between the highest and the lowest regions is also evident. And keep in mind that an average human needs around 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day to maintain the weight with moderate activity. So we could argue that the management of our resources, our food, is not currently optimal. That's quite accurate if we look at this figure too. We can see that our food production is responsible for around a quarter of all the greenhouse gas emissions globally. But to make things worse, around a quarter of that is created by foods that are being produced and never consumed. So we need to fix this inefficiency somehow. And that brings me to the total environmental impacts that our food production has globally. We can split them in 5 major categories, and we'll take a closer look at them individually in a bit. So we have the greenhouse gas emissions, the land use, which is about half of all land. We have around 70% of all the freshwater use. We have a lot of eutrophying emissions, which I will explain later what they are, and also a huge shift in the biodiversity of mammals on the planet. So as we can see, it's not a small impact at all. So let's start with the greenhouse gases. So what is causing all the emissions? As we can see, 18% comes from the supply chain. So all the food processing, the transportation. So this can always be reduced by buying local, etc. But as you can see, it's still a small percentage of the total food emissions. 31% comes from livestock and fisheries, and then we have a good chunk from crop production. 21% is for straight human consumption, 6% is used for animal feeds. And then we have a quarter for land use, most of it which is for livestock. So I think we should take a closer look at the food groups individually to see, because this is a bit confusing, right? So let's have a look at the European Union. What is causing the majority of their greenhouse gas emissions? From this, we can see that 83% is caused just by dairy, meat, and eggs alone. Does this mean that EU countries consume mainly these foods, so they eat nothing else, basically? Or do these foods have such a high footprint that it's contributing so much? The answer is a combination of both. Let's take a look at what and where do people in the US, for example, get their calories from, which is not very much from the EU nowadays. So as we can see, most of it comes from oils and fats and sugars, and only a small part comes from meat, dairy, and eggs. So the high footprint, this caloric supply should not be the reason behind the high footprint. So there must be something more about this. And indeed, as we can see from this figure, animal-derived foods have magnitudes higher greenhouse gas emissions for the same amount of calories produced. So this figure is for 1,000 calories. It compares how many kilograms of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases are created in the atmosphere. So all of this data I have taken from the latest and best science that we currently have, which was This one is particularly from a large meta-analysis done in 2018, which they looked over 38,000 different farms around the world, and they measured all kinds of things. And I have more figures from them later on. So as we can see, animal products are on the top, but there are also tomatoes, surprisingly. I'm not sure what was wrong with the tomato farms included, but 1,000 calories of tomatoes are about 6 kilos of tomatoes, so that could explain it. One could argue from this figure that maybe protein is hard to produce, and that's why the emissions are so high. So indeed, we have to create these foods in order to get enough protein. So if only they compared the protein produced and not just the calories, since we are getting more than enough calories as we saw before. Luckily they did, and the white dots on this figure represent the median values of the emissions from each food category. The mountains on the left of the median are usually, especially for the animal products, are very intensively produced products. So that's why their emissions are lower. So if you go to more grass-fed, free-range products, they are on the right side of the median. So here we can see that beef is the leader, followed by lamb, shrimps, cheese, pork, chicken, and then at the very end we have beans, peas, and nuts. And the nuts are even carbon negative because the trees are currently planted on cropland, and therefore they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Also, there is a really striking conclusion in this figure that about 70% of all our protein emissions only deliver around 25% of our total protein. And this looks to be very inefficient. So here are some endnotes on the greenhouse gas emissions. Methane, which is mostly produced by livestock, has up to 86 times greater global warming potential than carbon dioxide. And the emissions from livestock and natural gas are almost equal according to FAO. And animal agriculture is responsible for 65% of the global nitrous oxide emissions, which is almost 300 times a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And even without fossil fuels, we would exceed our greenhouse gas limit to prevent the 1.5% degree Celsius warming threshold by 2030, just by raising the animals that we're currently eating. And this large review also concluded that one can reduce their personal food emissions by up to 73% if they choose the correct foods. So let's have a look at the other 4 categories I mentioned earlier. Let's go to land use. So this is how the Earth's surface is currently being used. Around 29% of the Earth is land, the rest is oceans, as we know. And of that 29%, only 71% is habitable land. And from this land, 50%, around 50% is used for agriculture currently. The rest is forest, shrub, and lakes, rivers, etc. From the 50% that is used for agriculture, 77% is used for livestock, like meat and dairy, while 23% is used for crops for human consumption. And the caloric supply that we get from this 77% of land is only 18%. The rest, 82%, comes from plants. And there's a same inefficiency in protein as well. We only get 37% of the total protein we consume from this 77% of our agricultural land. Again, not so efficient. And this has been the main pattern in all the figures so far. So let's have a closer look at specific food groups again for 1,000 calories. For beef, we need over almost 120 square meters to produce 1,000 calories. And it's almost the same for lamb and mutton. And the rest is lower, of course. But at the very end are grains and vegetables, which require very little land. So why is so much land needed to produce 1,000 calories of these foods? The answer is that animal agriculture is very inefficient at providing us food. So you feed the animal, and the animal has to convert the food that you're feeding it into either excretions in sort of eggs and milk, or as muscle mass in the other categories. So during this conversion, they only retain less than a quarter for the excretions and even less for meat. For example, beef only keeps 3.8% of the protein that you feed it. So you can imagine how much protein is lost in beef agriculture. Even for poultry, which is the most efficient out of the farmed animals, we lose around 80% of the protein during the conversion. And in fact, we can produce 15 times more protein on any given area of land with plants rather than cows. And a few endnotes on the land use. Around a third of all land has been desertified due to animal agriculture. And animal agriculture is also responsible for around 90% of the Amazon deforestation, mostly to produce soybeans and other animal feeds. And like I said before, a plant-based diet would require 14 to 18 times less land than the average current diet. So now let's take a look at the water footprint. This is the third category from the impact. And this figure shows the amount of freshwater withdrawals in order to produce 100 grams of protein. Surprisingly to some, cheese and nuts are on top, followed by farmed prawns and milk and farmed fish. Then the usual meat suspects follow, and at the end we have pulses, peas, and soybeans. The reason cheese is so water intensive is because it needs a lot of milk to produce, which, as we can see, is very water intensive. So what's wrong with the nuts? 3 nuts were carbon negative just a moment ago, right? That's true, but in order to grow and absorb the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they require a lot of water, especially pistachios, almonds, and walnuts. So we should try to limit the intake of those for sure. Peanuts and other nuts and seeds, however, don't require as much water. But what about soy? We hear everywhere how soy farming is destroying our planet, and yet we have seen that it has very low carbon footprint and land and water use. So what about it? As we can see from this infographic, less than 3% of soy is actually being consumed directly, because most of it is fed to animals. And as we saw before, this conversion will waste a lot of energy and protein. So what is happening? Farmers clear more land, like in the images before, to grow more soy. Big traders, like the ones listed here, forward soy meal to big meat producing companies, which in turn sell the meat to the world. So ultimately, it is us and our money that pays for all this environmental destruction. But thankfully, we have the power to change this inefficient system. And a few endnotes on the water use. Almost 1,000 liters of water are required to produce a liter of cow's milk. That's why the cheese was so high. Meat and dairy alone use up around a third of all fresh water globally, in the midst of a water crisis in Africa and other regions. And animal agriculture uses around 56% of fresh water in the US, compared to only 5% that is used for households. So you can see how big the difference is. So what is eutrophication? Eutrophication occurs when a body of water becomes overly enriched with minerals and nutrients, which induce excessive growth of algae. This process results in oxygen depletion of the water body, which can be disastrous for the aquatic organisms. So the main man-made causes of eutrophication are nutrient runoffs from fertilizers and animal waste. How can we reduce fertilizer use? Reducing animal product consumption will drastically reduce the amount of fertilizers used, because as we saw earlier, animals require tons of food to grow and are not efficient converters. Buying organic is another way, of course, and when possible, should be preferred. We have to keep in mind another fact though. At any given moment in time, we have over 25 billion farmed animals alive, producing billions of kilos of excrements daily without any waste management. These result one way or another to freshwaters or the oceans, with devastating impacts, as seen here. Now let's have a look at eutrophying emissions for each food category per 1,000 calories produced. So these are measured in phosphate equivalents. As we can see here, seafood and meat products are on top of the list, alongside coffee. This is because during the processing of coffee, a lot of waste is dumped into the waterways, especially in countries with poor waste management. During the last 30 years, aquaculture has also exploded, especially in Asia, but at what cost? These farming methods are very destructive to the aquatic environment, as we can see from their high emissions. So if you love the oceans, you should really limit your coffee intake and probably stop eating fish and prawns. But you will ask now, what about wild caught fish and prawns, right? It's a good question. So let's have a look at the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Each figure represents approximately the area it's on. Light green is for, so these figures are for the percentage of the fisheries that are currently exploited, or the light green is developing, the yellow is fully exploited, orange is overexploited, brown is collapsed, and dark green is recovering. As we can see, the risk of fully depleting the seas is very real and could happen in our lifetime. That's because most of our fishing techniques are destructive and not selective at all. Most of our wild-caught fish comes from bottom trawling, which removes everything from the ocean floor, especially if they target small species such as shrimps. Because for shrimps, for every kilogram caught, it is estimated that around 10 kilograms of unwanted species are also caught. and then thrown back in the sea, dead, because they are unprofitable in the market. This is referred to as bycatch, and it can be anything such as dolphins, whales, seals, sharks, or turtles. Another issue with fishing is plastic pollution, as we mentioned in our first week of awareness. Most of the macroplastics found in our seas actually originate from discarded fishing gear, which pollutes and traps marine life. Finally, as a reminder, I wanted to bring up this figure again to show the last part. We have almost completely replaced wild mammals with our livestock. And if we add humans, the percentage rises to about, this percentage rises to around 98%. So only 2% of the mammals remaining today are wild animals, which is crazy. So what did I do after learning all this in Sweden? As a conscious and educated person, I did what I had to. So I made a change to my diet because I truly believe that knowledge is useless if you don't apply or share it. Just look at our political leaders and how they're dealing with important issues like the pandemic or sustainability in general. It's just frustrating. If we, the young and educated, don't change the system, then who will? However, after changing my diet, I discovered other benefits as well, not only environmental. I will briefly mention some. This map is showing the percentage of adults that are overweight in each country. It is measured using BMI, which stands for body mass index, and it is calculated based on height and weight. A BMI of over 25 means overweight, and over 30, it means obese. You can find online calculators to measure yours. As we can see, in all developed countries, over half the adults are overweight. And specifically in Saudi, over 60%. That's insane in my opinion, especially when there are people starving to death in other countries. A similar pattern is in children between ages 2 to 4. This generation could be the sickest generation of humans ever if we don't change the way we eat. In Saudi, over 40% of kids aged 2 to 4 are overweight. So what are the blue zones? They are regions around the world where people are living much longer than average. They consist of the Seventh-day Adventists in California, the people in Nicoya, Costa Rica, the Sardinians in Italy, the Greeks in Ikaria, and the Okinawans in Japan. And what do all of them have in common? Scientists have looked into it, and they came up that their food choices are primarily plant-based. They eat as much as 95% of their calories coming from vegetables, fruits, grains, and legumes. People in the blue zones typically avoid meat and dairy, as well as sugary foods and beverages. They also don't eat processed foods because they are not healthy. But what does the science say? What do the studies say? Here I have an image of DNA, so highlighting telomeres. And I'll explain why. Telomeres are regions of repetitive nucleotide sequences at each end of a chromosome, and they protect the end of the chromosome from deterioration or from fusion with neighboring chromosomes. And it has been found that telomere shortness in human beings is a prognostic marker of aging, disease, and premature morbidity. But it has also been found that a healthy plant-based lifestyle can increase relative telomere length and thus life expectancy. Also, higher animal protein intake is associated in many studies, but I'll just highlight a new one that I came up this month. Is associated, so higher animal protein intake is associated with higher all-cause mortality, whereas plant protein is inversely associated with all-cause mortality. Also, in his book, How Not to Die, Dr. Michael Greger explains, using over 2,000 scientific references, how to reduce your risk of dying from our top 15 causes of death by following a whole foods plant-based diet. And in a more recent book, which I read, also containing tons of references, they found that the single greatest predictor of a healthy gut microbiome is the diversity of plants in one's diet. I recommend both books. And since we are in the middle of a pandemic, I think it is also very relevant to mention this. Remember how many farmed animals are alive at any given time. These animals, often in very crowded conditions, get sick and die, which is not profitable for the industry. So what do they do to prevent this? They use tons of antibiotics. In fact, around 4 times more antibiotics are used in animal agriculture than for human treatments. Most of them are even fed to healthy animals to prevent their diseases. This is not without a cost, though. These conditions are perfect for the creation of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that have very high risks of pandemic potential. It's not a matter of if anymore, but when will the next pandemic occur? New ones show up every few years. A few examples from the past, the recent past, we have Spanish flu, SARS, we have avian flu, swine flu, West Nile virus, Ebola, MERS, now coronavirus. So the next one could be 10 or more times more lethal than COVID-19, and then we would be really screwed. So if you don't wish to stay in lockdown mode forever, you might want to help prevent the pandemics from emerging. And also during this presentation, I have referred to livestock as a commodity, a source of pollution or diseases, forgetting the fact that each kilogram of animal products comes from live animals. We kill a staggering amount every year. In fact, we slaughtered over 70 billion animals in 2018. To put this into perspective, during World War II, which lasted for years, around 85 million people were killed, which is nothing compared to these annual numbers. So how can we justify this ongoing cruelty when we have the resources and knowledge to optimize our food system? And it is a cruel and unfair system towards people as well, because vast areas are used in poorer countries for animal agriculture, but most of the products end up as overconsumption in wealthier countries. And let's not forget the people who work at slaughterhouses, who are usually people who don't have another choice. They get paid very little and develop mental health issues because of the horrifying practices they witness daily. But don't worry. So as we have seen in this presentation, diet matters a lot. But don't be discouraged, because we all have a choice that can make a massive difference to the world. So what would happen if we ate predominantly plant foods? We could reduce greenhouse gas emissions, free up land for wildlife and trees to absorb greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide. We could save fresh water, we could reduce eutrophication, save the oceans, we could all live healthier and longer lives, we could prevent pandemics, we could save billions of animal lives, and we could reduce inequality in the world. All of these benefits just with a simple diet change. And don't worry, you won't be alone. There are millions of people out there who consume predominantly plant foods. It's not just me. You may even know some of these people. For example, Djokovic, Hamilton, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Joaquin Phoenix, Joker, Spider-Man. Who else? Paul McCartney from the Beatles, Pamela Anderson, Moby, legendary Carl Lewis, Game of Thrones cast, and even more Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, and of course DiCaprio and Brad Pitt, Ellen DeGeneres, and Mike Tyson. So, as Sir David said recently, we must change our diet. The planet can't support billions of meat eaters. If we had a mostly plant-based diet, we could increase the yield of the land. We have an urgent need for free land. Nature is our biggest ally. Thanks for your attention, and please bring me some questions.
Thank you so much for a very insightful talk. I was so moved by it. Thank you so much. Any questions from our audience? Please raise your hand if you have any questions. I have a quick one. So you started 3 years ago, or how many years? And was like, how did you make the decision to go like based on plant diet? Because we eat
So,
here in Saudi Arabia, personally.
yes, unfortunately, yes. So I started in 2017 um, because of the sustainability, the environment, and later I was researching more and more, and I found out about the rest, as I said. So yeah, it was quite easy for me because I was eating quite healthy before. But I would recommend a slow approach. It would also give time to your gut microbiome to adapt, so you won't develop any problems.
Thank you so much. There are no more questions to our great speaker, Nikolaos. Then we will move on